Welcome, Kathy Giusti, a leader, a visionary, and a cancer crusader. Certainly, you are a woman leader of New Canaan. Thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, let's start at the beginning. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up and your family dynamics and things like that.
I grew up in a small town outside of Philadelphia, about 45 minutes outside of Philadelphia. And my mom had 4 children in 3 years. So I had 2 older brothers and an identical twin sister.
Oh my gosh.
So I would say growing up, our house was frenetic. But I would also say in some ways it was joyful, because to have your best friend grow up with you every step of the way, that's a real gift in life.
Wow, that is so unique.
Yeah.
Any good stories about growing up and going to school, and anything that you can talk a little bit about that to give us a sense of who you are?
You know, I'd say growing up it was pretty typical of suburban America. I think the one thing that was different with us was my father was one of the hardest working people I'd ever met. And he was a physician with his own practice, and his hours were long. And the thing about him is he never thought people should sit idle. So we grew up knowing you're either studying, you're doing your chores, you're learning, you're doing current events, but don't sit idle. And I think that has probably stayed with me, you know, in overdrive in some ways for all my life.
And where did you go to college?
I went to college at the University of Vermont. It's kind of funny, back then I had never seen the University of Vermont. So we all looked at our schools, we studied the different catalogs, and off I went. I was a skier. I knew I wanted to be pre-med, and they had a great science department, and that's where I headed.
That sounds interesting. So the science part is coming into play when you're in college.
Yeah.
After you graduated, tell us about some of the work you did after college and maybe how it was tied in.
Right. So I finished at the University of Vermont, and I was pre-med, and I ended up applying to medical school. And I applied to Jefferson in Philadelphia, which was one of the schools that accepted me. And simultaneously, they sent a note to my father saying, "Congratulations, your daughter's been accepted to medical school. Isn't that wonderful?" And so I went home, and I was having brunch with my father. I didn't even know he'd received the letter. He brought it out, and he ripped it up and said, "You should never do this. Do not go to medical school." And so I'm looking at him thinking, I just spent 4 years as a pre-med major. Why are you telling me this now? His view was medicine was getting to be very bureaucratic, and the ability to help the patients wasn't as strong as he'd hoped, and he thought I would do better in business. So I ended up working for Merck and going into sales and eventually headquarters in the pharmaceutical industry, still believing, you know, I had deferred, still believing I'd go back to medical school. But instead, I ended up going on to Harvard Business School and took the business route.
While you were at Merck, tell us a little bit about what that was like. Were there other women there? Did you feel like you were growing? What were you learning there?
I loved being at Merck. I thought it was a great company. I thought their sales training was phenomenal. They had amazing programs for potential managers. So we would go through those programs if you were a high opportunity employee. And they really did look for women. So it was a really productive and thoughtful environment as far as I was concerned. I ended up working for Merck for several years and worked for them in sales in the headquarters territory.
Where was that?
That was in West Point, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
It was interesting because when you're the sales rep in the headquarters territory, it means anybody coming into headquarters or anybody in headquarters, including senior managers, that wants to see what it's like out there on the road, they're traveling with you.
Oh, that's
so,
great.
Yeah, it's either you do great or you don't do great. So there's no in between. Fortunately for me, I did well, and I was promoted into headquarters where I really started to learn the whole marketing side. While I was at Merck, I really started to understand, even though I was good at science, I needed to know more on the business. And that was when I ended up applying to Harvard Business School and went there from 1983 to 1985.
Wow, that's amazing. And were you still single at the time?
I was. I ended up meeting my husband at Harvard Business School in the second year.
Wow,
surprisingly,
you got some
I did not meet him in class. I actually met him in an aerobics class that was going on down in the basement. If you remember back then, that was a big aerobics time. So that's where I met him.
What was it like living in Boston?
I loved Boston. I still love Boston. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful city, and I think Cambridge is spectacular. Now it's a huge growing hub of biotech and, technical and technology.
After Harvard, what happened?
So after I finished at Harvard, I went to consumer marketing. So one of my professors at Harvard Business School, recommended me for the Gillette company. And that was some of the best training I ever got. I had two amazing mentors there, Veronica Lewis and Marianne Page. They were both senior managers, and they really taught the art of not just sales and marketing, but how to communicate, with the written word and verbally, how to work with agencies, how to build brands, how to be persuasive. So all of that really helped me in later parts of my career.
That's great to have two mentors while you're at that company. How long were you there?
I was there about 5 years.
What a great experience, especially which took you into what you're doing now, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But before we get into that, when did you move to New Canaan?
We moved to New Canaan in 1997. Nicole was just about 2.5, and David was a month old when we moved here.
And how did you find New Canaan? What drew you here?
Well, we knew about New Canaan. My husband Paul had grown up in Stamford, so when we came back to visit family, we often came over here, and I just remember thinking the town was spectacular. I fell in love with it the moment I saw it. And then, ironically, when I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, a fatal cancer at the time, I knew that we needed to move from Chicago to be near our families. My identical twin sister was living in Greenwich. His parents were still in Stamford. So when we were looking at towns, we pretty much knew we would land in New Canaan, and I'm so glad we did.
I want to talk a little bit about New Canaan with you further on, but you have a twin sister. You've got to have a fun story about that, what it's like to have a twin.
Well, it is fun to have a twin. We don't really think that we even look alike. So one of the interesting things that happened when I did get sick and I was diagnosed with cancer, one of the best things that can happen is doing a stem cell transplant with an identical twin. So when the doctors found out, oh, she has an identical twin, that's going to be amazing, I kept saying, I don't know that she's identical. We'd never been tested. And anybody looking at the two of us would say they're absolutely identical, but we didn't look at each other that way. So I had to wait until she got tested to actually believe that we were identical twins. Meanwhile, everybody else was celebrating, thinking, that's a great gift to have when you're fighting a terrible disease.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about that. In 1996, you were diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us how that came about, what you were feeling, and what you were experiencing.
Mm-hmm. Back in 1996, we were living outside of Chicago, and we had our daughter, Nicole, and she was just amazing, and we were thinking, okay, we now need to move on and have a second child, but I was already in my late 30s. So when we decided to see a fertility specialist back then, you had to see a primary care doctor first, kind of the gatekeeper of the healthcare system. So I saw him, got blood tests done, and then he asked me to repeat them. Even then, I didn't think twice about that. And then later on, I was at a sales meeting for my job, and I came back, and there was a note on the counter that he had called, and Paul had written down, high protein in your blood, low hemoglobin, all these signs, and it said, please see me together, meaning husband and wife together. Now, I grew up with my father, who was a doctor. I knew that was horrible news, and that's basically when I called the doctor and said, tell me what's going on. And he explained that I had a blood cancer called multiple myeloma. Now back then, there was no internet. There's no internet. So I'm told on a Friday afternoon that I have this horrible disease, but I have nowhere to go. So the next morning, Paul and I got up early, and we're literally sitting outside in the Borders bookstore parking lot waiting for the store to open so we can research this. And I was smart enough to know that I would run to the Harrison's internal medicine book and pull it down, and the more I read, the more crushing it was. It was basically 3 years at best. And there was no black or white in there. There's no drugs, there's nothing you can do. Just get ready, get your life in order and get ready.
So between the dates of 96 when you found out and when you started the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, what was going on there, and how did the foundation come about?
What happened was I was still working at Searle, a major pharmaceutical company. I was running initially worldwide operations for them, and then I was doing a rotation out in the regional sales force. So I was working, and when everybody heard I got this diagnosis, I literally had to go into a leave, to start getting second, third opinions. There was a United Way campaign going on at the company at the time, and so all of the employees who had heard what happened to me said that they wanted to give funding to me and research in multiple myeloma. I didn't have anywhere for them to give it, so my sister, who's an attorney, started a charity for me, and that United Way campaign became the first donations to the MMRF.
That is a terrific story. Wow,
Yeah.
that's like kind of the aha moment for a lot of people, realizing this is something that needs attention.
Yes, yeah, the disease had been so neglected. It skews older, male, African American. Nobody was paying a single bit of attention to it, and nor was I typically the poster child for it, but there was no work being done at all.
Kathy, what is the MMRF known for?
The great thing about the MMRF is it's probably viewed as the most successful disease nonprofit in the United States today. And even though we started in little New Canaan, we are a global organization at this point, making a huge difference in a model that, many are copying. What is different about us is that with a patient lens that I could see where the problems were in the healthcare ecosystem, but yet a business mind, we were able to create the business models that would solve the problem. So initially, I learned in myeloma, the big problem was you couldn't get access to tissue samples. Without access to samples, you can't do the science. So we built our own tissue bank and generated over 4,000 samples for our scientists to use. Then when genomic sequencing started, we reached out to the right partners and said, if we give you the samples, will you sequence the myeloma genome? We were one of the first cancers to ever sequence our genome. And then when we decided it wasn't enough for us to do the genomic sequencing and the data to be held within, because academic centers have their data, we have our data, we said we needed one huge open data sharing platform, and that became our Compass study and a newly launched CureCloud study. And on top of all that, we have our own clinical network of 20 centers that have conducted over about 100 phase 1 and 2 trials. All of that has led to 13 new drugs in the field of myeloma since we started. And while patients lived 3 years when I started, they are up to a decade now. And the science is moving so fast that for every year we buy them, we can promise them something amazing is going to happen in either targeted therapy like precision medicine or immunotherapy. So it's really an exciting time, and we're at the forefront.
That must be so gratifying for you.
It is gratifying, but I'm always reminded the patients that are doing well are not the patients reaching out to us. They're living their lives, thank goodness. It's the patients who are struggling, that they've still run out of options. They don't know what to do. They're the ones that reach out, and usually they're challenged. They may be running out of options. I think it keeps us on our game because we have never become complacent. The disease is still not cured. It's still fatal. Yes, you can live longer with it, but we still have work to do.
You just mentioned challenges. What are some of the greater challenges that you experienced as you were putting together the foundation?
The healthcare system is incredibly broken. And interestingly, I think we've seen it firsthand with COVID-19. It's not a surprise to any of us that work in the system that it's so broken, but you have to understand that it's not bad people. It's just a bad system. Academic medical centers and the people working in them are rewarded off publications, grant money, and getting promoted. Pharmaceutical companies have shareholders. It's expected. They have to report back to their shareholders. And so the patients get lost in the middle because you do want those new drugs, you do want data shared, but the incentives aren't aligned to do that. So what we did at the MMRF was we said, that's a broken ecosystem. We'll put our own ecosystem on top of it, and instead we'll have our own reward system. You will get the funding when you share your data. You will get the funding when your clinical trials get done on time. So we ran it like a business. We knew what the scientific issues were. We knew the promise of the science, but we knew business incentives would make it happen faster.
Speaking of the financial part of it, you are friendly with Mr. Kraft, Robert Kraft.
Yes,
Tell us how
yes.
that relationship came about and what's happening there.
I was asked by Dean Noria, the Dean of Harvard Business School, to come up and work at Harvard Business School because he had accepted an endowment from Robert and Jonathan Kraft in the field of precision medicine. The reason that Robert and Jonathan Kraft gave this $20 million endowment to Harvard was because he had lost his wife, Myra, to ovarian cancer. They had sequenced her genome, but they couldn't find a drug fast enough for her, and so she passed away. So he gave this endowment to HBS, and then the dean called me and said, please come up here and run this organization for us. So with my co-chair, Richard Hammermesh, we spent 4 years up there bringing together the best of the best in oncology to share best practices, and then look at the challenges we were all facing and create business models to solve them. I think it was the most promising 4 years I ever had, because on one hand I was taking great ideas from the MMRF and sharing them with all of the other diseases, but on the other hand, they had great ideas that I could bring back to the MMRF. So depending on which way I was traveling on the merit, I always felt like it was a productive loop that I was having. And I did really love working for the dean and the Krafts. Their hearts were in the right place. They knew the business of science was important, and they really supported our work.
That's fantastic. Now you're still connected to Harvard. What are you up to
with
Harvard?
I am. So now what I do, we actually took all of the information from the 300 people that we convened up at Harvard Business School, and we decided to write the Playbook for Cures, which is now an online learning. Again, another big thing that came up in COVID was we're all home. There's 22,000 disease groups. The best way to teach them is not to have them call me individually because I can't get to them, but to actually give them everything they need to write strong business plans, to understand strategy, leadership, investment, all the things that we focused on at the MMRF. So they have all the tools they need now. In addition, I then brought together a group of the top 8 CEOs across all diseases, from cystic fibrosis to Michael J. Fox, and we're all working together in a post-COVID world to say, healthcare has changed, what are we going to do to make sure we're changing with it?
It's such an incredible story, Kathy. You've done so much, and you've received several awards for your leadership. I could rattle off a whole bunch, but I'm just going to ask you, which one is the most important award you've received?
I would say the one that was the Time 100 most influential. I think these awards are really hard to get. When you look at the other people that win them,
yeah, who else was in the category with you?
I mean, it's usually Michelle Obama. It's movie stars and actors, people that have huge, huge platforms. And when you look at it, you realize somebody saw the importance of science and technology in terms of health. And I can't stress it enough. Like, you are nothing without your health. So everything else goes away. The minute you get a cancer diagnosis, your life changes forever, forever. And you can never take each day for granted.
One of the reasons we're here today is because we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and giving the women the right to vote. If you were around back then, would you be involved with all of that? Would you be a supporter?
Being brutally honest, I will say I'm not so much a political person, but I truly appreciate the brave women that go ahead of me and really forge ahead in the political landscape to allow us to vote. One of the greatest gifts I ever had running the Myeloma Research Foundation was when Geraldine Ferraro was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and she was my mentor. So for 10 years, I worked side by side with one of the most amazing women who worked both sides of the aisle. And ironically, at the same time, Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison's brother was diagnosed. We would go to Senate hearings, we'd walk the halls, and those two women were like this, together, unified, common goal. And I was their triplet, just learning and so grateful for the opportunity.
You've surrounded yourself with a lot of really fantastic people, a lot of powerful women. Yeah. What are some of the traits and attributes that you think make a successful leader?
I think for leadership, you have to be able to have your strong point of view, and again, back to my mentors, be able to articulate it clearly so that people really know what you stand for. I think the one other thing that really helped me throughout my career was being diagnosed with a fatal disease where you thought you were only living 3 years. I had no time. So if I was going to get anything done, I had to be taking risks and be ridiculously decisive. I think the greatest trait I have now is I've kept that. I never take my foot off the pedal, and I'm hugely decisive. And I think that just, whether you're confident or not, make the decision. Just go for it, and if you mess up, pivot, try again.
Kathy, do you think women are more successful in a leadership role? And if so, maybe give some examples.
I think many women have demonstrated how strong they can be in leadership roles. And I think when those role models are out there, we're all watching and listening to them. So what I'm listening for is, what are some of the major CEOs doing out there? I'll listen to Katrina Lake, who graduated from HBS and runs Stitch Fix, or Jen Hyman, who's running Rent the Runway. And here, these industries are blowing up right now. I listen to their podcasts, I follow their every move, and I try to learn from everything they're saying. I think one of the most amazing things I'm hearing now from female CEOs, small companies or bigger companies, is that COVID has changed a lot for them. They actually are now able to be home more and still run their companies and still get to know their employees much better. I think the whole world is going to change in so many ways, and I think it's going to be an advantage to women.
What is the best advice you've ever received?
The best advice I've received is go for it. Just do it. What are you waiting for? And I think it went hand in hand with the way I had to run my life, thinking I didn't have time. I never minded if I made a mistake or if somebody working with me made it a mistake, as long as we learned from it and we could modify and try again.
If there's a young woman out there coming from college or starting to get into a career, is there any advice you'd provide them now that you wish you might have known when you were getting out of college?
I think the advice I usually give them is, when you can get the training, get the training. I think one of the best things that happened to me was I started with the training, like I mentioned, in sales and marketing and big companies. And that was excellent, because then by the time I needed to become an entrepreneur, I felt like I had the skills that were so important to be a good entrepreneur. So it's not like you have to spend a decade getting that training, but I do think it's important. I also think the knowledge cross-functionally is critical too.
Let's talk about New Canaan.
Yeah.
What is special about New Canaan to you and your family?
I have so many good things to say about New Canaan from every which way. So I was working so hard on the foundation. Now, you're an entrepreneur, you're trying to get this off the ground. The fundraising is not easy. The world doesn't really know what multiple myeloma is. It was challenging in every way, but when I look back on the volunteers that supported me, the members of New Canaan that today are still sitting on our board of directors, there is no way I would have gotten the MMRF off the ground without a lot of hardworking people in this town. But secondly, while I was busy at work, we had this amazing community of teachers and coaches and counselors that were constantly there for our two children. And I think that is one of the greatest gifts of this town. I can't tell you how much I feel like I owe some of those teachers, or David's baseball coach, or Nicole's photography teacher, people that just made them so comfortable and gave them the confidence they needed to become, in my mind, two superstars.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Are there any special places in New Canaan that you love?
I love Waveney Park. I don't know what I would do without Waveney Park. Every morning before work, I'm running back there. And there's a community of us that we kind of see each other, we give the waves, kind of like have a great day. And everybody's there now. I mean, in COVID, everybody's walking dogs, and it's just such a great gift for the entire community. But I also love when the holidays are here and all the work that gets put into making this town so gorgeous at Christmas and at Thanksgiving, and everybody's just so thoughtful in making you proud of the way your town looks.
Kathy, what gives you hope?
For me, I'm so focused on people staying healthy, because I think that people think that every day is handed to them, or that they're invincible, that you won't get that call. You have cancer, you have Parkinson's, you have Alzheimer's. I think we all feel invincible. The truth is, one way or another, we all get that. And my greatest hope is that we can all work together in those diseases and in those industries to change them, because they're disastrous when the call comes. And I don't wish that on anybody. So I certainly hope that the progress we've made in myeloma, we can keep making in cancer, and we can share that model with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and truly change the world.
Kathy Giusti, thank you so much for being with us today. You truly are a woman leader in New Canaan.
Thank you.